Throughout America's story, there are defining days. Days when minds change, hearts fill, and imaginations soar. Days when visions transform the trajectory of the American story, which is our story. Doing what is hard and achieving what is great, that is what stirs humankind. That's what unites us. With inspiration and innovation, no Herculean effort is too large. No moonshot is beyond our reach.
And liftoff of Artemis 1.
A new generation, the Artemis generation, stands ready. Ready to return humanity to the moon and then to take us further than ever before to Mars. Let us continue the quest to unfold this universe. And let us continue to find unity in our discovery. So together, let us continue to dream the impossible dream that now becomes real. Then let us traverse the untouched terrain of the once unreachable stars.
Well, welcome everyone. We are so glad that you wanted to come and talk to us. We are going to have a conversation. Bill and I served together in the U.S. Senate. Bill represented Florida. Bill's a Democrat. I represented Texas. I'm a Republican. And we are united now together in continuing something that we started and that we will go forward and talk about in bipartisanship, working together, which I think is going to be so important as we go into the future. And this is an accomplishment of back when we were in the Senate together, that we produced together. And that was making sure that we kept space exploration, that we kept the importance of space exploration, because there were many in Congress and really in the public, because the shuttles had gone down, been eliminated, and why go back to space? Why should we go back to space? And so Bill and I teamed up together and said, we see a future that's more important than any of us for now, but for the future. And Bill, you were the leader, and I was your cohort, your side saddle, and we did it. And now look what you're doing to implement that vision that we had.
Well, just don't listen to all of that. You know, Kay's the leader too. Kay would be the chairman when the Republicans had the majority, and I'd be the chairman, and each of us would be the ranking member. But we worked together. We're going to tell you about the NASA bill. That video has now come full circle into fruition, that what we put in legislation set the course for NASA that you saw on the video. Kay and I are going to talk about a lot of other things, that how we got along with others in the Senate. But people are just so shocked when we say that Republicans and Democrats get along. It was certainly that way when I went to Congress many, many moons ago, and Tip O'Neill was the speaker and the Republican leader was Bob Michael, and they'd have their fights, and at the end of the day, they were friends. So when it got time to do the deal, they could do it. And I told Kay, this morning the story about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, two old Irishmen that would fight like cats and dogs. But at the end of the day, they'd go enjoy an Irish whiskey and they could get things done. And it's not widely known, but when Ronald Reagan was near death after the attempted assassination, it was Tip O'Neill was up there in his hospital room on his knees. So we get along. Let's tell them about NASA, how we do.
Well, one of the things that really the transformative bill that kept NASA going was 2010, when the expenses were large, we didn't have shuttles, and so Bill and I got together with great staff people that were just knew so much about how things were compartmentalized, and we did a public-private partnership. So now you see the private missiles that are going up, the shuttles that are in trial now to begin to take astronauts up, that are being privately put together and privately going up with NASA. And we made the bill so that NASA would stay in the lead, but work with the private sector, sharing expenses, and making sure that we didn't lose it. We put, at that time, we put a U.S. laboratory designation in the space station so that we could do experiments up there, and especially in healthcare, where doctors wanted to try to see how the cancer cells would grow, and they could only do it in microgravity condition and get the best results. And so that has spurred a lot of healthcare research because we did that lab designation.
And this lady is the one that's responsible for getting the National Lab designation on the International Space Station. And this has the status, just as our other labs that are all around the country in Lawrence, Livermore, Sandia. You can go on around the country. Major research is going on. Now, it's been a long time coming. When I flew in space back 38 years ago, I did one of the first cancer research projects sponsored at the time by the medical school at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And it was taking proteins and growing them in crystal form in the 0G of orbit. That is just now coming into its own. I had to do it on the space shuttle flight, 6 days in space, max 2 weeks. Now we have, thanks to Kay, full-time national lab on the International Space Station where we have astronauts around the clock that are doing these experiments. You are going to be seeing major breakthroughs coming out in the news about cancer research and drugs for other things as a result of growing the crystals in 0G where they grow larger and more pure so that you can then understand with an electron microscope whatever their molecular structure. And once you know the molecular structure, you can continue on your research. You're also going to be seeing coming out as a result of taking stem cells to the 0G of orbit. They grow because they all don't clump to the bottom in gravity. They're suspended. And you can grow them a lot more, and they grow in different ways that they grow on Earth. That's just some of the things that this lady is responsible for.
Well, no, don't say that, because everything we did was together. But how many members of Congress have ever flown in space?
John Glenn who was a member of the Senate years after he was the first to orbit the Earth for America. Jake Garn, who flew a couple of months before me, a member of the Senate from Utah. He was the chairman in the Senate. I was the chairman in the House. NASA decided they were going to fly both of us. And then now we have Mark Kelly from Arizona, who was the commander of the next to the last space shuttle flight, STS-134. As I say about Mark Kelly, one of the major things about him is not as an astronaut. He showed us how to be a husband.
Oh, that is so true. Gosh, married to Gabby Giffords, who got shot while she was doing her job as a United States Congressman, having a town hall meeting in front of a grocery store. Yeah, you're right about that. And Harrison Schmidt. But there were only very few, of which you are one. And so it's a group of 5. So very, very impressive and important that you had that experience and also knew the value. There's one other point I want to make about why it was so important that we save space exploration. When I was at NATO, I was a U.S. ambassador to NATO a few years ago. That is when we started looking at space as a domain for defense. Now we have a U.S. Space Force that was put into place because now we have adversaries up in space with space stations and with the capability to do satellites. And we've got to be there at the top. We've got to know what's up there. We've got to know how to make sure that our signals are not intercepted. We've got to make sure that the space debris, which is becoming a real issue for the space station, we've got to be up there and operating. And if we hadn't been able to save the importance of NASA to see the future, it would have affected our national security for a long time to come, because we know that that there is a lot of activity, especially in the Chinese space station, that they're not sharing. We share ours with Russia, so we know what they're doing. That's important. And why don't you talk, as the administrator of NASA right now, about our cooperation with Russia? That is probably one of the very few areas where we have maintained. I'll let you take it.
Well, think about it. In the Cold War, Soviet Union, America, nuclear hundreds, thousands of nuclear missiles pointed at each other, having come very close to nuclear war and the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. And along the line, leaders in both countries started thinking that since both countries had very developed space program, Soviets had beat us to space, Sputnik. They beat us in space to orbit with Yuri Gagarin. And by the way, that video was on the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's speech at Rice Stadium in Houston, where he really got it going. He had already spoken to a joint session of Congress in '61 before Glenn flew, just right after Alan Shepard had flown, and he had only flown suborbit, just go up and come down. And of course, the Russians had gone up twice with Gagarin and Titov. And Kennedy made that bold declaration in a joint session of Congress that we're going to the moon by the end of the decade and return safely. It didn't really catch a lot of fire until John Glenn flew. And America went nuts. And Glenn was just the beginning of a whole series. So Kennedy then, wanting to accelerate the program and get the funding, goes to Houston, to Rice Stadium. Johnson, his vice president, is right behind him, who, by the way, that was an interesting tandem that warred against each other. However, it was Kennedy's vision, and Johnson is the one that carried it through after the assassination. And Kennedy says at Rice, we go to the moon and do other things, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And space is hard. And
I'm going to interrupt
Go
you
ahead,
for a
please.
moment, and I'm going to say the whole quote was, why did we climb the highest mountain? Why do we, what was the second one? Okay, why do we fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? Because it's, so I got to get the whole
show
quote
us,
in there.
show us.
That's what got the attention of Texans. So, but back to just quickly, because then I want to move on to some of our anecdotes about bipartisanship, which I think are so relevant today. But that we are still having a partnership with Russia. We take Russian astronauts to the space station. They take our astronauts. We always have one of each on every shuttle, but that has maintained. And at one point, one of the Russian representatives of space kind of started veering off of thinking this was a priority, and he got fired. So,
As a matter of fact, so in this Cold War, two space nations said, why don't we start cooperating? 1975, an American spacecraft, Apollo, rendezvous and docks with a Soviet spacecraft, Soyuz, and the crews lived together. And that started this cooperation between our two nations. They built the first space station, Mir. We sent our space shuttle to dock with Mir. Then we built the space station together. We operated together. And you can imagine how that is being tested today with the tension. We are the only point of contact now of cooperation between our two governments. And as Kay just said, we launch an American astronaut on a Soyuz with the two cosmonauts. They launch, we launch with a Russian cosmonaut with 3 American astronauts on our Dragon. And we have to operate the station together. They have the propulsion, we have the electricity.
I want to go back to where you started just in the beginning and talking about the cooperation in Congress that we don't see. Honestly, I know, and we're not going to talk about the presidential election. Bill can't do political things, and I'm not going to either. But in Congress, even though the rhetoric is harsh, just as we have just seen in the presidential debate, but in Congress, you see the rhetoric and you see the back and forth all the time. But so much is done together that isn't seen. And I saw, for instance, in the Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, there was always a bipartisan support for our Armed Services Bill and the authorization, and the respect that the Republicans and Democrats had for the importance of not just appropriating for defense, but to having a bipartisan authorization for what was important to be in the defense bill, so that one party could never just say, well, these are our priorities. No, you go with the Department of Defense, you learn what the priorities and needs are, you take all of the facts in together, and the Armed Services Bill and the appropriations bills passed bipartisan. So many of the big things, our new NASA reorganization bill that we passed, that was huge for the future, as we're seeing now. That was bipartisan. You do see cooperation with the ranking member and the chairman because it changes with the control of Congress, with the control of each house. So people know that the ones that they're going to work with most closely are the ones that are going to be there for them when they're in charge or when they're not and the other's in charge. Give some examples.
And those are the ones that get the things done. They're not the bomb throwers. It's the people that will come together and in mutual good friendship and trust be able to work together to hammer out differences. In the case of the space program, it wasn't so much differences that you were hammering out. It was the complexity of setting the architecture for a space program for 25 to 50 years to come. And that's what you saw in the video. Many other examples. Most of you all know who Ted Cruz is. Ted Cruz, you would look at him and hear some of his speeches and you think he might be a bomb thrower. On some things, he is. I got along with Ted Cruz. So, as a matter of fact, the way it happened was that lady right there, Grace Nelson, my wife. We were in Ted's first year, and he was the main person causing the government shutdown. And we were going into the third week of the government shutdown, and the Republicans were getting blamed for this. And he was the point person. So we're in session on a Saturday, and the Republicans have just had a caucus, and they have really given it to Ted because he's hurting the public image of the party. And so after this caucus, he's wandering around in the basement of the Capitol. Grace is down there since we're in session. She sees Ted, and she runs over to him and says, "Hi, Ted. I'm Grace Nelson. I'm Bill's wife. I haven't met you." And she's friendly to him, and he perks up. And they have a nice conversation because he had been on the whipping block the previous hour. And they're having a good conversation. And she says, "Ted, why don't you have dinner with us tonight? I want you to know I am probably the only senator that has taken Ted Cruz to dinner." And we worked together on things that we could work together. He was on the Commerce Committee as I, both the chairman and the ranking of the Space and Science Subcommittee. And we could work those things out. I'll tell you something else. When the president, they let it leak that he was going to put me at NASA, the first call I got when it leaked in the press was from Ted Cruz. And he said,
Really?
"I'm for you."
That's great. Yeah. That is great. You know, and that really matches some of my experiences where when you get to know the other senators from the other party, you do work together where you can. I was carrying a bill that was so important for my constituents, and it was the lifting of the Wright Amendment, which was an amendment that limited air service from Love Field, and there were more and more people that wanted to be able to fly from Dallas Love Field to Missouri or Alabama, or Oklahoma, but it was restricted. And the people from DFW Airport, also my constituents, were very skeptical of taking business away from the DFW Airport and making it less able to be operated in an efficient way. So I had been working with the mayors of Dallas and Fort Worth, and I was hunkered down trying to get them to agree on what was the right thing. They were not in agreement, but they finally, came to this rapprochement. And we were in December in session when we were getting ready to go out for the Christmas break, and I had to pass it because if we didn't pass it then, we would have had to start all over in January because there was a new Congress coming in. Barbara Boxer, the Democrat from California, was filibustering, and she had said, I am not letting anybody take the floor away from me because I am going to keep the floor. She had an issue with another senator on another issue, and I went over to her. She was by herself on the Senate floor, and I said, Barbara, this is a local issue that we have worked for 2 years to come together. I've got to pass it, and you please let me at least take it if I promise to give you the mic back. And she said, oh, I don't know. So she thought about it, and she said, if you stay right here on the floor, I will give you 2 minutes. I will let you have it if you promise you will give it right back, and there will be nothing intervening. I said, done. She did it. We passed that bill that has transformed aviation in that part of my state. And who would have ever thought, Barbara Boxer and I, and Barbara Boxer had made the meanest floor speech when I first came to the Senate, my first time to make a speech. She ripped me apart. And yet she saved one of the most important bills that I ever passed because we got to know each other, because we didn't vote together, but we had a friendship that was made by the women senators having dinner once a month, Republicans and Democrats, and we got to know each other as moms and wives and the things that we had to do because we were in the Senate, and our kids might have been at our home state, or they might have been in Virginia or Maryland, and we talked about those issues, and we got to know each other. And Barbara Boxer and I never changed our philosophy, but when it mattered that we could work together. So she made that accommodation. I mean, that's when people get to know each other, like what Grace did.
Now, that happens all the time. You just don't see it. But it is an ugly time in politics. It's become an in-your-face blood sport. It's gotten much more partisan. It would be hard to imagine that back in the days when Mike Mansfield from Montana was the majority leader, and a Democratic senator, he was the Democratic majority leader, a Democratic senator had gone back on his word to a Republican senator about an amendment and legislation. And Mike Mansfield found out about it. Democratic leader goes over to the Democratic senator and says, if you don't go and apologize and withdraw your amendment, I am going to yank the entire bill, which was the Democratic senator's bill, because he wasn't going to stand on the question of principle of saying something and then lying about it. Of course, you see so much different in politics today. And so how do we get back to the respect in the public square? That's a tall order. You want to take the first crack at it?
Well, I think one thing is, and this is a procedural question. The House and Senate don't coordinate their schedules. And so the Senate will take a week doing amendments on a bill and pass the bill, and the House will be out of session. So you don't get that bill taken up by the House, And it's like they don't even talk to each other. So coordinating the schedule so that people are in session more would do two things. It would allow a much more efficient passing of legislation that's must pass. Those are the things that have to pass, like the appropriations bills to keep the government open. But it also gives people a chance to get to know each other, which is what we're losing and why I think there's more acrimony. We don't stay in session that much anymore. We don't stay in Washington. They used to go to Washington for 6 months, like January to June, and then they would go home for 6 months and stay in their districts or their states. They would get to know each other by having social events and getting to know families. And Lady Bird Johnson told me that's what made everything work so much better. And now we don't do that. We fly in on Monday, start business on Tuesday, fly out on Thursday, and then maybe the other body isn't in session the next week. So you've lost all that time. And that's not fair to the taxpayers, but it's also not producing collegiality, which would be so much more helpful.
So what are some of the things that we can do? Trips, going on trips together, they call them congressional delegations, where it's a bipartisan group with spouses. That makes a world of difference of getting to know, because everybody, as Kay says, when they start smelling jet fumes on Thursday afternoons, they're headed to the airport to go back to their states. It's interesting, another little shared thing that you don't know about, it all started back with President Eisenhower. He invited a group of bipartisan senators down to the White House, and he said, "This is the loneliest house in America. I need to have some friendships, and I want to do it around the question of a prayer breakfast." And what has come out of that is a national prayer breakfast with the president and members of Congress. But what has come out of that on Capitol Hill is every week there is a bipartisan prayer breakfast, members only, on the House on Thursday mornings and Senate on Wednesday mornings. And you check your partisanship and you go in there and talk about very personal things with each other. Those are some of the things that we can do.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because those prayer breakfasts make such great friendships. And you're sworn to secrecy. And people do talk about challenges that they face. They've talked about personal problems that they have. They've talked about grieving when they've lost a loved one. And I have never heard one time that there's been any leak from what any senator has said. And it's a wonderful thing, and it does produce a really good feeling. I'm going to digress for one moment, because Mike Mansfield, you mentioned Mike Mansfield. I used to sit next to Mike Mansfield on Wednesday mornings for our prayer breakfast. He came, he was a former senator then, of course, he was the great leader, but former senators are always welcome at those, and I still go when I'm in Washington. But I sit next to Mike Mansfield. We just started doing that every week. And Mike Mansfield was 90 years old at the time, and I looked at his plate one day. He had the same thing every time. It was eggs, biscuits and gravy, bacon. I mean, the whole shebang. And I looked at him one day and I said, you know, it's just nice to see a guy that still eats like a guy. He loved it, because all of us were taking yogurt and granola. And
You made him an honorary Texan.
Absolutely. That was a Texas breakfast.
All right, we've got about 15 minutes. Let's open it up to your comments and questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, first of all, I'll say this is such a treat. Thank you both so My name is Monica. I currently work for Boeing on the Starliner program there in Houston. And my question is regarding, relationships and maintaining them with international partners, right? We know we're going to deorbit the ISS in some time. That contract was just awarded, right? How are we going to maintain that positive relationship we have with other countries to ensure we continue partnering with them on things like space exploration, establishing a lunar base, et cetera?
Did you plant that question?
No?
Thank you. That is a fabulous question because he has been a leader in I'm on the NASA Advisory Council. He asked me to do that. I'm the co-chairman of the international outreach group that he created. So tell them why you did that.
Yeah. As a result of Kay and a former Democratic Congresswoman
Jane
that I
Harman.
asked to be on, Jane Harman from California, I'm taking them with me on trips to see presidents of other countries. And a good example of how Kay added so much on the visit to Bogota to see President Petro. I'm in there talking to him about what we can provide from our satellites to help him with them trying to stop the destruction of the rainforest in the upper Amazon. And then Kay is there, and all of a sudden we find out that Colombia is like an honorary partner to NATO. And so here I've got the immediate past ambassador from NATO to chime in on there, and we took another woman, a 4-star United States Southern Command commander, General Laura Richardson, and she's talking to him about military cooperation on all of the drug traffic and so forth. And so, these bipartisan partnerships don't stop just at Capitol Hill. It's continuing.
And what Bill did is on this trip, we were able to do this, and Bill would go and talk to the university and the scientists and talk about NASA satellites. And he's producing American soft power by encouraging these other countries. And I went with him to South America, but he goes just about every month to another area of the world, whether it's India or Kazakhstan or Europe. And it's soft power. It's saying, work with us, be transparent, let's share information. Let's talk about what satellites can do for your farmers to know when to plant and when to harvest. I mean, it is a wonderful byproduct of the importance of what we're doing to make more friends. And it was very interesting because I was coming, the ambassador from Argentina asked me when I was going to be there with Bill, asked me if I would talk to one of the leaders of Argentina about NATO because they were interested in pursuing a partnership. Colombia is an official partner of NATO. NATO has 32 allies where we've given the commitment, if one of us is attacked, we're all attacked. But we have 40 partners that people don't know that also work with NATO and are interoperable. Colombia is one. And Argentina is now, because I did that, Bill was talking to the scientists, and Argentina has a wonderful program as well. And I went at the request of the ambassador from America to Argentina to talk about NATO. In April, the general of the armed services of Argentina went to NATO and is beginning the process of an official partnership with NATO. And what that means is that we are now going to have the beginning, and when Argentina joins, others will too. That means we can have interoperability with our military, with our exercises, with our even disaster relief. So we have more soft power in South America, which is something that is so necessary and so important and so timely. But it all started because you thought that we ought to be reaching out to international and producing that soft power with what America has, the treasure of American technology, innovation, and space exploration. Thank you. I know he planted that question.
I'm going to answer specifically your question very, very quickly. After we deorbit the aging International Space Station, we will have commercial space stations in place, and so NASA can concentrate its effort out beyond low Earth orbit. We go back to the moon, and we're going back to the moon with the crew next year. We go back differently. We go with commercial partners, and we go with international partners. And so I hope that we can pick up, if not the Russians, and we have tried, and it's going to take a while. I would hope that eventually, instead of us being at odds with China and Russia in space, in civilian space, I would hope that we could do things, a continuation of what started way back in 1975 in the midst of the Cold War.
So other questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your service in a bipartisan fashion. I used to work for Senator Paul Simon from Illinois, who both of you know, who was a sweetheart.
Yeah.
This morning, the Supreme Court destroyed the power of administrative agencies of the federal government that has existed for years and years and years. Do you think that the result of McConnell's leadership with respect to the appointments to the Supreme Court, which were different in terms of timing than when you were both in service in the Senate, has really contributed to the deterioration of this bipartisan nature that the both of you have really furthered?
Well, let me say that certainly we have seen the Supreme Court tackle some issues, and the controversial ones, I'll say. I think that on the issue of the administrative regulations, I haven't looked at exactly what that does, but I did hear the news this morning that they are having that they are saying that the administrative agencies have gone too far, and in some cases they have. And as a member of Congress, it is very important that an administrative agency follow the law that was put in place. It is the law. But some administrative agencies have gone far beyond and put their stamp on a regulation that isn't what Congress intended at all. And I think that's what was trying to be addressed. Now, how it was, I'm not yet competent because I haven't seen exactly what they did. But when I was campaigning for the Senate, I had as one of my issues that we need to make sure that regulatory agencies follow what a law does. Because I'm going to say this from my standpoint, and this may be where Bill and I even disagree, but I think we are looking at the use of an Endangered Species Act to, for other purposes, go out and shut down a pipeline. Now, that's not what was intended to save endangered species. We do want to save endangered species, but we don't. Congress hasn't passed a law to shut down pipelines, and it doesn't have anything to do with endangered species. So I think there has to be a nexus between the law and what a regulatory agency does. So I'll have to look at what the Supreme Court did to see if I agree with it or not, and I don't agree with some of the things that the Supreme Court does. I didn't before either. That's why you have the appointments that come with each president. And I don't know that I agree that lifetime appointments are a good thing either, but that is in the Constitution, and it would have to take a constitutional amendment to put some kind of limit on those terms, but that's another story.
To look at the part of your question, which is the trend toward hyper-partisanship. And the essence is that that's the trend that we're going. And that's not necessarily a good thing. As a matter of fact, the Senate is structured so that senators take the floor and do a filibuster. So the House rushes to judgment and in the hot, white heat of passion passes a bill. And then it comes to the Senate to be the cooling saucer before the beverage is consumed. That is breaking down because the idea of the filibuster was to slow down legislation and, very importantly, protect the rights of the minority. But that has been, in my opinion, misused. And as a result, you're seeing the filibuster eliminated for certain things. Supreme Court appointments are one of them now. And as a result of that, Mitch McConnell was in a position that up until that change, he was in a position to hold up an appointee to the Supreme Court and basically deny that appointment to the court. Next question. Let's get in the back. Yes.
Thank you. Given that trend toward hyperpartisanship, what do you think it would take to get more friendship across the aisle again? And do you think it's possible to get back to that?
I do. I think it's going to take one of two things, and maybe both. I think it's going to take one side getting beat so bad in the election, up and down the ballot, for the other side then to come to their senses and start to work together. Or it's going to take a national or international catastrophe. We thought it might happen after September the 11th, 2001. And there was a period of good bipartisanship there. But then that started to dissipate as you got to these wedge issues of abortion and gay marriage and all the others that have been in the news.
I've got one other to add to that, and that is changing the primary systems in these states. This is a state issue, how you have your primaries. But I think having a primary that is open, a Republican and a Democrat and an independent can all be in the primary. It's kind of the Louisiana system. They're all in the primary, and then at the November election, the top two will go into a runoff. That could be 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, or 1 of each. And then you have the runoff in January. That would mean that people could vote for a Republican for Senate and a Democrat for governor and a Republican for lieutenant governor, and people would have a choice, and you would have centrists that would be able to get into the mix earlier than a primary where it is just one party against the other party, and the more radical extremes tend to be nominated. So I think changing the primary systems is another way that we could bring a lot more of the mainstream into the system earlier and create a better environment.
And putting guardrails around gerrymandering of congressional districts. Gerrymanders have been with us since the entire history of the United States, but gerrymanders got very sophisticated with the use of computers to find what voters are voting in this precinct and that precinct and that precinct, and then already predetermine the outcome of how that election was going to go in the general election. So we've got to but that's been struggled in the courts and is still struggling.
Okay, I'm seeing that we are now at the time limit. I'll take one last question, quick, right here.
This may just be a mental exercise of no importance, but
And by the way, I'm rewarding you because you sat on the front row. That's always empty.
okay. And this is this is a related question. Do we make reaching consensus and discussion much more difficult when we polarize the state of our politics and culture as being polarized or highly or divided, as opposed to what I've seen in my discussions across the spectrum as being much more fractured and splintered? You see the difference between polarized and a whole bunch of pieces laying around where some people can agree and so forth. Does that make sense? No. Okay.
I don't understand the difference that you're saying.
Well, polarized means it's just
polarizing
A
and
or B,
fractured.
north or south, east, west, good, bad, Republican, Democrat. Fractured is a whole bunch of pieces. Like when you drop something on the floor, like a piece of glass on the floor, and it's all over. And when you're trying to work across something that's fractured, it's easier to find pieces that'll fit together.
Well, our politics is a combination of all of that right
Okay.
now. And that's why Kay and I, wanted to bring to you our story of cooperation that not only occurred in the Senate, but today still occurs in our nation's space program. Thank you.
You all so much for coming. Great to be with you.